the Loins of History podcast. My name is Jay, and I'm joined by my co-host, Collin. This week, we're going to be discussing a history of American political parties, continuing our series on American political foundations. Here in the United States, we have two main political parties, Republicans and Democrats. And we were just not controversial enough on our last episode. So we're going to take on the most controversial topic probably in this in the political discussion today. And
everyone handles these conversations very well.
Yes, we're super cordial. No. So we're going to talk about the history behind Republicans and Democrats kind of together, not really looking at one and then looking at the other one, but looking at the history of both Republicans and Democrats together. So, Collin, what are some themes that our listeners should be thinking about during this episode?
Yeah, I think Mark Twain, there's a quote from him that kind of sums it up, and it's history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And I think that's very true of the American political parties. There are a lot of continuities, especially on the underlying values that they hold as at their core. But there's been a lot of changes, and I think it's critical to understand what major changes have occurred, why they occurred, and what has stayed the same if you really want to understand what these parties stand for today. I think that there's a pretty simple definition that I kind of made up for what a political party actually is, because I think that's a great jumping off point. I personally believe a political party is the result when people who by nature are tribal or communal have a voice in their government. And what I mean by that is, a political party represents a large group of people's interests, common interests. And, if people are by nature communal and tribal, just go to a sports bar wearing your favorite sports team jersey. Let's just call them the Miami Hurricanes. You are going to gravitate more toward the people that have a similar jersey. And that's kind of what a political party is. You may be very different. You might have, some minor differences of opinion on what you believe that the best outcome could be, but they most align with you. And that's kind of what Democrats and Republicans do. And there's a spectrum and there's different factions that exist, but by and large, it's just a natural evolution, political evolution that occurs when you have large groups of people coming together and want to, I guess, enact a common outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I tend to agree with what you're saying, Collin. Human beings, we just gravitate towards one another, and we gravitate towards people who are like-minded. When we do that and we form relationships with similar or like-minded people, we tend to try to use that synergistic effect to accomplish things, right? Whether it be operate a farm, operate a business, form a family, you name it. We try to do these things, and political parties are no different. So bottom line, I guess one thing that I would like for our listeners to take away is that political parties are not bad in and of themselves. They are also not good simply because they're a political party. Similarly, political parties are also ideologically agnostic. And it's important to keep this in mind, because I recall having heard someone explain, well, the main difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Republicans believe the U.S. is a republic and Democrats believe the U.S. is a democracy. And we're clearly, one or the other. And it's like, that really has
how wrong that
has
is.
Nothing to do with, understanding the differences between the two parties. Democracy, in my words, we are a democratic republic.
So it's interesting that you use the word democratic republic, and it's because I think that ties in pretty nicely to where they actually started and got their names from. So Jay, how did our political parties actually get started?
Hey, so our political parties really have their roots in the first dichotomy in this country, and that was between the Federalists and the Anti Federalists. It would be a mistake to put hey, Republicans were Federalists and Democrats would be Anti Federalists, although that is the way that they most closely align. But essentially, I'm not going to rehash too much on Federalists and Anti Federalists. You can listen to some earlier episodes in this series, specifically episodes 1 and 2, where we discuss the political ideology behind the American Revolution. And then episode 2, where we talk about the Constitution a little bit more specifically. But generally speaking, Federalists supported a strong federal government. They were pro central bank and they wanted positive relations with Great Britain, not just because of a ethnic and linguistic commonality, but a lot of the loyalist monarchists began migrating towards the Federalist side of things after the American Revolution. Conversely, anti-Federalists, they supported a weak federal government, hence anti-federalists. The Bill of Rights is in the Constitution largely through the efforts of anti-federalists. They wanted to see the states as the primary governing body in the land. They were against the central bank and a lot of the government, or sorry, federally regulated monetary policy. And they wanted positive relations with France. And that was in large part due to sympathies with the French Revolution. So the two guys that kind of embodied these two things was John Adams for the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson for the Anti-Federalists.
Yeah, and I think there's, with the Federalists favoring relations with Britain, being very leery of France with the French Revolution, they felt that it would potentially destabilize their new republic, and we talked about that previously. It's what led to the wildly unpopular Alien Sedition Acts, whereas Jefferson obviously sympathized with the French, and he was very pro-revolution, pro-common man, if you will. Plus, the French did help the United States defeat the British and gain independence. So, just want to make that point.
Yeah, and I just want to say there were good aspects from both of these sides of the aisle, so to speak. I personally, like, if one were to ask me the question, Jay, if you were alive during that time, would you have been an anti-federalist and a federalist? And my answer to that question is I don't know, because I kind of like both of them.
I would have been both. Well, if you read the Federalist Papers, which were designed to convince, it was almost a plea to have a stronger federal government. And if you read it, they make a lot of really good arguments. And even with an anti-federalist government, I think a lot of the anti-federalists said, "Hey, yeah, we actually probably do need some of those aspects. We just need to make sure that there is something like the Bill of Rights in there in order to check some of these. We don't want a central bank. That's something we're not going to compromise on it." But if you read the Federalist Papers, they make a lot of very good points, and with majority tyranny, things like that they're trying to avoid, and checks and balances. So it's really, you're right. I say all that just to say it'd be very difficult to decide, well, am I an anti-federalist or am I a federalist? And I would be willing to bet dollars to donuts that your average John Smith American in 1795 probably was not, he probably would not have an affiliation and say, I'm an
No.
anti-federalist or I'm a federalist. They probably had
Right.
some loyalty to a Jefferson, a Washington, or a John Adams, someone like that. That's probably where their earliest loyalties lied,
Mhm.
not a party.
Or, especially for common folks who they hated the most. If they were like, hey, we hate the French, then they probably would have been and a good Englishman. They still may have viewed themselves as Englishmen or British rather. Then maybe they would have considered themselves Federalists. And conversely, if someone was a true patriot and hated what the Brits were doing at that time and were sympathetic to the French, then maybe they would have considered themselves like an anti-federalist, irrespective of any ideological bias. They've just been like, oh, I like the French, so, or I don't like the Brits. You know what I mean?
And honestly, that's kind of funny because that's probably a lot of how people are now. They have some sort of nominal affiliation with a party, but it's really like, I really hate that person or I really like that person.
Mm.
They have a dog. I want to vote for them. They look good. He's a family man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stuff like
There's
that.
a
You're
lot of
right.
truth to that. Unfortunately,
And
hey,
I think, no, go ahead.
we make decisions based on emotions, not rational analysis.
Look at our political parties and the candidates we put in charge.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, so just kind of moving on here. After this long struggle between the Federalists and the Anti Federalists, really the party of Jefferson won out there in the early Republic and really dominated the American political scene through all the way through Andrew Jackson. So you had Thomas Jefferson as the president in the early 1800s, and Andrew Jackson, 20-ish years later, I think.
Yeah, about that.
Madison, the guy who wrote the Constitution, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, was an ideological disciple of Jefferson, interestingly
Mm-hmm.
enough. So, really, the party of Jefferson and the Anti Federalists, so to speak, kind of triumphed there in the early political party, or sorry, in the early Republic. This is important to note because the historical heirs of the Anti-Federalists dominated American politics until the Civil War. Like, it's kind of overgeneralizing, but generally
But it's not.
speaking, yeah,
They
generally
dominated.
speaking,
They really did.
yeah, for about the first 80 years of our country's existence, which is not a small amount of time in American speak here. And I'm sure some of our European listeners are chuckling right now.
We've been around for over 1,000 years.
back
The
when
Magna-
the Norman, back when the
the
Normans
Magna
invaded
Carta
in
was-
1066.
The Magna Carta was signed in 1215.
Yeah, those silly, really, those young whippersnappers over there.
Those opinions became irrelevant in 1776.
That's right. Hey, Colin. Do you know why here in the or why in Great Britain they spelled canceled with 2 L's?
I don't know.
And here in the United States, we only spell it with 1. That's because we gave those Brits an extra L in 1776.
I love it. We have a large contingent of British listeners that I'm sure hate this.
I was fortunate enough in my life to be able to tell that joke to one Brit, and I literally think he was going to kill me. Anyway, we digress. Yeah, so the Anti-Federalists, what will soon become known as the Democrat Republicans, what we're just going to say is the Democrats, because that was really the ideological heirs of the party of Jefferson. Go ahead.
I think Jackson dropped the Republican part and it just became Democrats. I think it was Jackson at that point. They became known as the Democrats from there on out.
Right. So kind of real briefly, after the period of Federalists and Anti-Federalists, you did have you had the Whig Party form. The Whigs, it's not really fair to say that they were Federalists. The party of Jefferson and the Democrats were so dominant during that point in time that the Whig Party could really be considered a subsection of the same party of Jefferson, but they were a little bit more right-leaning, so to speak, and did have a lot more sympathy with the party of Adams and the Federalists. For example, they supported slavery, which a lot of Jeffersonian Democrats also supported, but they were pro-British, and demographically speaking, the Whigs primarily consisted of the middle and upper classes in the Northeast, which was the same demographic of the Federalists.
Yeah, Jay, and you bring up the Whigs, and I think that's a good time to say that there was a couple other smaller parties that began to form in the 1840s as abolition and slavery became a greater issue at the national level. It was no longer just segmented to different parts of the country. This became a national issue, and some of those parties were the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party. Later, the Anti-Nebraska Party would come along, and they were absolutely abolitionists. Now, I will make a point. Not all of them were abolitionist or anti-slavery expanding to the West, because a lot of them had fears, and they played on this of slave owners who were wealthy at the time buying up land that would otherwise be sold to them and utilizing cheap labor in states that they otherwise could. So there was an abolition sect. I don't know. I say that just say there's an abolition sect, but there's also just an anti-slavery only because for economic purposes. Now, with the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854, two states, Kansas and Nebraska, obviously were admitted as slave states. This is against the Missouri Compromise, which basically drew a line and it said everything north of this is free, everything below is a slave state. If you look at a map, this violates that. This breaks the parallel. So these two both entered as a slave state. You've heard bloody Kansas. This is a pivotal moment in American politics because it really, in my opinion, and in Colin's opinion, this is kind of where the seeds of this, well, I should say the seeds of the Civil War. This is where the Civil War actually starting to pick up and actually become a reality. And I think a lot of people started reading the writing on the wall because anyway, I say all that to go into the Republican Party was born out of this. The Republican Party, as the Whigs began to dissolve, and the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, these anti-Nebraska party came together and said, we need to form a new party. And the Republican Party was chosen as the name.
I think it's worth kind of sitting down and camping out here on the Kansas and Nebraska Act because I agree. 1854 is a pivotal year for the next 100 plus years of American history. It
Right.
was really the major break within the Democratic Party on the issue of slavery. Prior to 1854, the Democrats, the party of Jefferson, dominated American politics. They were pro-slavery the whole time. When they broke the unwritten rules, or sorry, they did break the
Definitely
Missouri
written.
Compromise. Yeah,
It was
they did
definitely
break the
written.
rule. And they said, hey, the loose confederation, you had the Whigs, you had the Free Soil, you had all these other parties. The loose confederation were basically like, hey, if you keep slavery down in the South, we're not going to be able to mount a strong enough opposition to seriously contest the dominance that the Democrats had. The Democrats overplayed their hand. They were
Mhm.
able to pass the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which allowed Kansas and Nebraska to enter the Union as slaveholding states. And that was seen as a betrayal by quite a bit of wealthy Northeastern Protestant voters. And that's when they really began to realize, hey, the issue of slavery is no longer an issue of tolerance. It's an issue of what I believe to be morally right, an issue of the way I see our country going, and the Democrats need to be checked.
This was also one of the first times that forced people to pick a side. Before, like you said, it's the Whigs, but it's kind of like, they're almost a faction. They were a party, but it's really more of a faction. This is you're picking a side at this point with this Kansas Nebraska Act. Pick a side. You're either a Republican or you're a Democrat. And you had the Anti Federalists and the Federalists, but honestly, I think that was fought at higher levels amongst the elite and the founders. This is really for everybody. Now you have to pick a side, and like I said, this is sort of where you're starting to see that the inevitability of a civil war. And the Republicans, so their first candidate, Fremont, ran in 1856. He came in second, which is astonishing if you think about it. We talked about the basically political monopoly that the Democrats had, and suddenly this loose confederation and this brand new party of the Republicans places second, and then they win in 1860 with Lincoln.
Right. Yeah, and Lincoln, this is one of the reasons why he is such a pivotal figure in US history and why a lot of times today the Republican Party is called the Party of Lincoln in the same way that I've been calling the Anti Federalists, Democrat Republicans, Democrats, the Party of Jefferson, is that he was essentially the founding father, Lincoln was, of the Republican Party. And we're not going to go too far down the rabbit hole of what started the Civil War, but just for understanding kind of how the Republican Party came to be, it was very much the singular main issue at hand here was slavery. And Lincoln was very much in line. Before he became president, he did run on an abolitionist platform. And then later, once he was elected, actually, and the Civil War started, actually backed off on a lot of that stuff. But go ahead, Colin.
He was actually would have been considered a moderate. There's a fantastic book called Team of Rivals, and it's about Lincoln and his cabinet that he assembles. Honestly, one of the best books I've ever read. What it shows within his cabinet, there were varying degrees of, I guess, abolition and how they wanted to handle it. And Lincoln had to navigate this. But yes, Lincoln, I would say, would have been considered a moderate, to be honest. But like you
Yeah.
said, the Democrats overplayed their hand and forced the issue.
Yeah, the no, you're exactly right. And just a little teaser, when we start talking about Reagan, one of my arguments about Ronald Reagan was that he also, like Lincoln, was probably more moderate than what we tend to think of him today, and more of a pragmatist. Team of Rivals, in particular, talks about how Lincoln was just trying to keep the country together. Uh,
Preserve the Union. That was
right.
his goal.
They were more pragmatists than kind of how history claims them to be, one way or the other. Anyway, FDR is another one of those pragmatists, but we'll get there eventually. Um, yeah, so another issue that was big for Republicans was the issue of taxation and government intervention in the economy. So the if we think of Republicans kind of as the historical continuity of the Federalists and the Whigs, we see that these this these wealthy northeastern folks were usually more in favor of government intervention in the economy, the central bank being the main issue there for the early republic. And the Republicans were very pro banks, they were pro government regulation of the economy, etc. I'm bringing this up because this shifts about 100 years later.
Well, it's, if you watch news cycles, especially from like the 2000s, like pre 2010, pre financially, even with the financial crisis of 2008, and the Republicans are absolutely branded as like the big, and they've had this reputation for a long time as like the party of big business, the business friendly party. They get that reputation following the Civil War. Um, During Reconstruction, post Reconstruction, there's this time called the Gilded Age where the United States was beginning to experience the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of wealth was created. So we get the captains of industry, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, Morgan, all those. That this is where they started to become immensely wealthy, and there was a lot of corruption in politics, and the Republicans basically dominated politics. Like the Democrats prior to the Civil War, the Republicans dominated all the way up until the Great Depression in 1929.
So in the same way that Republicans were kind of the historical heirs of the Federalists and the Whigs, the Democrats, I think it's still helpful to think of the Democrats as the party of individual liberty. Go ahead.
Jay, I was going to say, what I think was a great analogy that you used. It's back in the freedom of speech episode where you said there's two different types of thought in art, where you had the art that was rigid and form, it was by form, and there's a certain
Yeah.
rules, but it's almost
The
rules based art.
classical
I would
and
say
the romantics. Yeah.
the classical. That's it. The classical versus the romantics. I almost kind of see, if you were to paint a very loose picture of the parties, I think that kind of sums it up pretty well. Like Republicans are typically kind of classical. They favor process and rules and rule of law, things
Yeah.
like that. Whereas Democrats, it's kind of this individual common man type of, emotion based decisions, rule of the, will of the people, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
I just
No.
want to say, I thought that was a great analogy that you brought up. And I think it's applicable here.
Yeah. No. I think you're right. And to to me, this is super interesting because surely a lot of us have taken these which political party do you seem to align with the most, and blah 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 blah. What makes those tests and the presuppositions behind that, how we think about our political system, so problematic is that they're never fully descriptive of the whole and therefore misleading. So, just to give an example of that, if we kind of using what you're talking about, Colin, if Republicans are typically classicists, right, classical leaning folks, and Democrats, and this is 1800s Republicans and Democrats, are more individual liberty and leaning on the romanticism side of the things, I think it would also be fair to say, if we look at the dichotomy between collectivism and individualism, the Republicans would lean more towards collectivism and the Democrats would lean more towards individualism, because in order to properly order society, you're placing the good of the whole above the good of the individual. In today's terms, post Marx, post communism, or I don't know if I would say we're post communism because they're still around, unfortunately.
I would say that I think it's a little premature to get to this, but I think when we start talking recent history, like 2008, 2010, I think was a pivotal moment where you start to see a lot of that unravel and change very quickly. So I would say
I
that's a
would
little sneak peek of what we're going to talk about in the next couple episodes.
kind of to finish the thought on the Democrats here. They're the party of individual liberty still during the Civil War time. And the main appeal that Southern Democrats make to retain the institution of slavery is an appeal to individual rights. They're claiming that they have the right to property, and this property is another human being. Whereas the Republicans, on the other hand, are making the claim for the common good, and are saying that the institution of slavery is a moral evil and we as a society need to remove your quote unquote right to property for the sake of the common good. The reason why I'm bringing this up as an example is to just say, of all the historical continuities, the Democrats are much more libertarian, shall we say, in maintaining individual liberty. Go ahead.
Don't tell some of the Democratic politicians that now. They might not like it. But
Hey,
there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. There's not a lot of truth. It is true. It's fact. What's what happened.
yeah, it's fact. I said it.
Can't argue. Can't argue. Jay said it.
No, no. The Again, as an aside, because of this historical continuity and why I bring up libertarians, I personally believe, logically speaking, that modern day libertarians have more in common with Democrats, both historical and today, than they do with Republicans, both historical and today. And this is interesting because most of the people that I know who claim to be libertarians would also consider themselves conservatives and or still a part of the Republican Party.
That's why we talked about in the beginning of the episode. It's important to understand where your party came from, what changes have been made, and what's still the same, because there have been a lot of changes, and
Right.
this is one of them. Because you blew some people's minds by saying that libertarians are more in common with the democratic principles that they
Yeah.
espouse,
And we'll
not
get
necessarily
into
practice, but
this when we start talking about FDR here in a little bit, but the idea of being a liberal is also commonly associated with the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. But that's, again, to be a liberal, whether a classical liberal or whatever we want to call ourselves, it's typically associated with the Democrats. Hey, one more thing to note about some differences between Republicans and Democrats during the time of the 1850s, 1860s, and a little bit beyond. were their religious demographics. So at that time, Republicans primarily consisted of Northeastern Protestants who wanted the government to enforce a Christian view of morality. Again, this is consistent with federalism in that they, Republicans were just generally more in favor of government intervention, federal government intervention in creating an order or creating a good society that they wanted to see. Conversely, at that time, Democrats primarily consisted of Catholics and high church Lutherans and Episcopalians who did not want the government to enforce a certain moral code. Of note, really in the Reconstruction age, we see alcohol and prohibition start surfacing as a major talking point between the Republicans and the Democrats, and it's consistent with this idea of their religious view of the world, because Republicans were generally pro prohibition and Democrats were usually anti prohibition.
That almost sounds familiar. It's almost like it that popped its head up again, during the conservative coalition during the 60s as a counter movement to,
Yeah,
the,
but it flipped.
it flipped. It's weird how that happens. Yeah. And I also think that
It's super interesting how this happens.
and hopefully we can add a little context to why it did. And yeah, so great point. I just want to let you know that it happens again a few more times.
Yeah, it's really funny. Like, I don't want to say it. I don't want to get. I want our listeners, as we were doing research for this, and I hope our listeners are catching on. There are themes. There are big themes, and what political points are important to certain groups of Americans. What's super interesting is that all this flips in the 20th century, and we'll talk about here in a little bit on why that happened.
So Jay, that was all good. Those were good points, and I think it's important to note that after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, that's where the Republicans entered their period of basically dominance. It was basically a monopoly, similar to how the Democrats were the party prior to the Civil War. The Republicans afterward, all the way up until Hoover and the crash in '29, with a few exceptions, but I think you see, and this is where they get they're kind of branded the party of business. That's stuck around with them for over 100 years afterward, because the United States was enjoying the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. An immense amount of wealth became realized by some individuals like J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, Rockefeller, all of those folks. And a lot of that money started to flow into politics. It is an extremely corrupt time. I think Grant had one of the most corrupt cabinets in history. But part of that was from Republicans passing legislation that favored a lot of these big businesses. And that, like you're saying, these themes that kind of stick up until honestly fairly recently, they were the party of business. And this is where it gets its start in the Gilded Age. It's interesting to note, we're talking about post-Civil War, the Republicans actually were the ones that had the first African-American senator and member of House of Representatives. Hiram Revels was the first black senator from Mississippi, and Joseph Rainey was a representative from South Carolina. So it's interesting to note that this is part of the reason they also got the party of Lincoln, because this happened, I think, in around 1870. So just a few years after the Civil War, that this was able to happen, and it's really a monumental event that these men were able to achieve office that quickly after the Civil War.
All right, so kind of shifting gears here to leading up into the 20th century, World War One, World War Two. What's going on is, like Colin said, you had Republican domination, you had a booming economy, you had the Roaring Twenties, and
Just
then
how
you had
powerful,
prohibition.
just how powerful was our economy?
It became the United States became the largest and most powerful economy in the world somewhere right around the turn of the century. I want to say it was like 1890 something.
I think that's important to note because that was part of the reason I think the Republicans were able to maintain such a stranglehold on politics is that amount of wealth and money and American quote exceptionalism kind of began right there. So
So a quick Google search tells me that in 1890, the United States has become the largest economy, and we have never relinquished that position.
132 years going strong, baby.
America.
We're gonna have to edit that out.
America. No, we're not. um, hey, capitalism. It's a beautiful thing. Industrial revolution lifted lots of people out of poverty. And if somebody wants to debate me on that, please go ahead. But will tell you that today's poverty looks like wealth and riches compared to 1890 poverty.
Speaking of which, one of our follow-on episodes will be on communism in the United States and then capitalism in the United States. So we will talk more about these and debate them. But you're right. Thank you, student of Milton Friedman.
Yeah. So the United States economy is booming in the early 1900s. And even in World War One, we had a very strong economy. The Republicans were still in charge. And then the Great Depression happens. And interestingly enough, if you look on a chart of the growth of the American economy, the Great Depression was about a 10-year period of a huge downturn, stagnation, and then very slow growth until World War II hits. What this did, politically speaking, between the two parties was it ruined the Republican Party for a time, and it gave power to the Democrats in the person of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So FDR was a historical Democrat. But one of the new things that FDR contributed to the Democratic Party that had not been there before was this idea of social programs, primarily in his New Deal. And his New Deal was wildly popular with Americans. I mean, FDR and his programs did a lot to elevate the United States out of the Great Depression, primarily in the form of putting people to work. Go ahead.
Exactly. Not only did he put people to work, but you talk about this theme of the common man. In his fireside chats, you think about it, this is the first time the president of the United States came and was in your living room talking directly to you. I think that's another way that you said at an emotional level, we make decisions, people going back to work so they can put food on the table, but then they're hearing this man's voice in their house. Most of these people probably never had electricity before, or maybe they did, but the radio was brand new. So this is incredible. I think that did a lot for people to establish an emotional connection to the Democrat Party, which is why for a generation, the Democrats remain in power.
Yeah, it's still mind-blowing to think that FDR, not only did he win re-election for a second term, he won re-election for a third term and a fourth term, back to back to back to back. Successful re-election bids, and on the heels of Republicans, with only two exceptions, since Lincoln dominating the American political landscape.
And I would just note,
it was truly impressive.
One of those exceptions was due to his cousin Teddy Roosevelt splitting the vote in 1912. So the Roosevelts
bringing in old Woodrow Wilson. So in contrast to FDR and the Democrats, you had the Republicans becoming more and more isolationist and nationalist. So there was an organization that formed in the 30s called the America First Committee. And I really hope this sounds familiar to all of us here. Yeah. So like this theme of make America great again, America first. Hey, let's focus on the United States before we focus on the rest of the world. This started early in the 1900s. I think the American First Committee was in the 30s, but the idea was definitely still
No, it goes
around.
even further than that. Because think about the Know Nothing Party, which was basically a faction. But yeah, they were very isolationist. They were nativist. So the point is, it goes to the Know Nothings, and it's probably even got seeds before that. So it's nothing new. This whole idea of Make America Great Again, America First Committee, the Know Nothing Party. It's nothing new. We've just seen it in
Yeah.
different forms.
So this is kind of a teaser for our next episode where we talk about more modern stuff in depth, but we begin to see that the Republican Party is focused on staying out of foreign interventionism, and then you have the Democratic Party being more in favor of foreign interventionism, albeit lightly. So there's never really been a warmongering faction here in the United States, which is interesting because I know there's a lot of entities outside the United States that view the United States as a bunch of warmongers. And, 2003 didn't do us any favors. 1990 didn't do us any favors. 1950 didn't do us any favors.
Pre-World War
Vietnam
II.
didn't do us any favors.
Pre-World War II. Pre-World War II.
Yeah. So even after World War II, the main thrust of American foreign policy has always been non-interventionism. And as a matter of fact, when America has decided after World War II to get involved in foreign conflicts, we've always done it half-heartedly with significant reservations and under very confused goals and objectives. Again, we'll talk about this more in our next episode, but average American citizen has usually been isolationist to a certain degree. And when we see the Republicans and Democrats more or less switch later on in the 20th century, part of the reason is that Republicans started becoming the party of isolationists, which was a more common viewpoint. Just asking everybody to remember, the Democrats for this whole time has been the party of the common man. But then the Democrats under FDR become more and more interventionists in nature. And this partially explains, from a foreign policy standpoint, the switch that comes later. People tend to think that because Barack Obama wanted to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan, that he was this isolationist. He was not.
We surged in 2011. We killed a crap load of people with drones.
And we tend to think, we wrongfully think today that Republicans are, that Democrats are weak in foreign policy. And, like Hillary Clinton, for example, Hillary Clinton has a very aggressive foreign policy viewpoint. For example, she was kind of put in timeout to a certain extent under the Obama administration. And a lot of people assumed that she would actually have been made the Secretary of Defense, not the Secretary of State. But the Obama administration did not want to do that in what was very much a unholy alliance, so to speak, between Obama and Clinton. If people remember, their campaigns against one another in the primary was kind of ugly. Anyway, the only point I'm trying to make is that historically speaking, in the 20th century, Democrats have been more pro-intervention and Republicans have been more isolationist.
Yeah, let's see.
And Trump is actually consistent. He is a consistent Republican by wanting to pull out of Iraq, pull out of Afghanistan, pull out of Syria, all this stuff.
Let's see. Truman intervened in Korea.
JFK intervened in Vietnam.
Followed by Johnson, kept keeping us there. It was Nixon that brought us home.
Mm-hmm. So I call Reagan the ultimate pragmatist because Reagan is a Republican, is isolationist, but one of his main, he got elected because the Carter administration looked weak against Iran and was looking weak against Russia. So Reagan is actually an inconsistent Republican. Fantastic, but he's an inconsistent Republican because we got freaking Grenada, his VP,
Iran
H.W.
Contra.
Bush, not exactly his fault, but Iran Contra. His VP did Iraq the first time.
So, Jay, World War II is obviously, for so many reasons, a pivotal moment in history. Specific to what we're talking about today, what did the landscape of politics look like right after VJ Day?
Yeah, so right after VJ Day, politically speaking, FDR and the Democratic Party created a blueprint that Democrats still try to follow to this day. Government involvement in fixing economic problems was an FDR thing, and they still try to do that today. Conversely, Republicans see, hey, we avoided the worst of World War II and World War I, by the way, by not getting involved at the beginning. And it's also important to note that the Red Scare had not yet occurred. In 1945, the Red Scare hadn't really happened yet. Yes, there were folks who were warning about communism, warning about what was going on in Russia and how it was impacting the rest of the world, but it did not really come to scale until a couple years after the late 40s, and then really in the 50s the Red Scare became a thing. I bring that up to say that the Democratic Party, again, modeling itself after FDR, was not that concerned about the threat of communism. FDR had a very good relationship with Joseph Stalin, called him Uncle Joe. The two of them got along really, really well. FDR was very much in favor of providing economic aid to the Russians under Lend-Lease at basically no cost whatsoever.
And it turns out that Joseph Stalin even was kind enough to send some of his closest advisors to assist with the FDR
Yeah.
cabinet.
Again, just another shout out to Herb Romerstein and M. Stanton Evans' book, Stalin's Secret Agents. Fantastic
What a
book.
guy.
Yeah. Harry Hopkins was a Soviet agent that worked in the Roosevelt administration. Alger Hiss was another one. Anyway, again, that model that made FDR so successful is what Democrats still try to follow to this day. And Republicans at that time did not entirely see interventionism as, World War I and World War II did not exonerate the interventionists. Rather, they saw, hey, we took a face shot in Pearl Harbor, but we avoided Verdun, we avoided Ypres, we avoided the worst fighting of World War I. We avoided the worst fighting, in a sense, of World War II, not in the Pacific theater, but in the
The
European
Eastern
theater for sure.
Front. Yeah. I mean, think about the Russians, little known fact, absorbed a massive amount of casualties from the Germans and occupied most of the German resources in World War II.
Right.
Most people don't like to admit that in America, but that's very true.
Right. And on the Western side, I mean, France suffered quite a bit, but even Great Britain, Germany expended a whole lot of energy during the Battle of Britain trying to take Britain out of the war. The Luftwaffe was almost in shambles by the end of the Battle of Britain because the Royal Air Force was so determined, thinking about that
It's
stiff British upper lip.
because they ate carrots and it helped their eyes. That
Oh
was one of the
yeah, is that
rumors
right?
that it was so they could cover up the use of radar. It was like a propaganda thing. But
Oh wow,
it's
that's awesome.
interesting. I don't think the Germans actually entered wartime production levels until like 1942 or 43. It was already too late at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I don't
Whereas
know if you want to.
that's right when the United States got up
Yeah,
and
it's when we
moving
got
too.
involved. It's basically when we got involved. They were like, oh, and also Barbarossa was not going well.
So again, for political party, at the time of World War II, and when FDR was so successful, the threat of communism in the Cold War had not yet begun. And the reason why I make this point, and we're going to talk about it more in our next episode, is that foreign policy moves to one of the forefront. Economics, to a certain extent, has always been the dominant issue in Republican, or sorry, has always been the dominant issue in American politics. But foreign policy, during the time of Jackson, was really not too much of a concern. It was, territorial expansion here in the continental United States was way more of a concern up until the Spanish American War. But foreign policy begins to move to the forefront, and the political power balance is affected by the question of how Republicans and Democrats decide to handle the Russians in particular.
You mentioned the economics, the foreign policy, but there's also what we're going to see with the civil rights movement. It had started really decades before, obviously, with the abolitionists, the Civil War, the rise, the women's rights movement. But the civil rights era and how we handle social issues really comes to define politics over the next really till present day. And I think that really becomes a major issue again during the late 50s, 60s, 70s. So that's another important issue we're going to talk about next week.
Yeah, I do think, you mentioned women's rights. It's important to note that women's suffrage was primarily supported by Republicans and opposed by Democrats. Yeah, fun fact. If you were to ask the average American which political party supported women's suffrage, they would almost universally say Democrats, and that was not the case. All right, so we're gonna press pause there for this episode, kind of talking about the history of American political parties. Our next episode, we're going to continue the history. We're going to talk really about 1950 to the present day. We're going to cover how changing economic conditions, changing social conditions, and the Cold War really changed how American political parties, what's important to them, their demographics, their voter base, etc., and see how all these things play together. Civil rights, how all that contributes to the changing political environment here in the United States, and gets us to the present day. So thank you so much for listening in. Hey, we really appreciate all the feedback. If there is anything that you disagree with us on, please, leave us a comment, send us a message. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. All of the links to all those ways to give us feedback are here in the show notes. If you like what we're doing here, please like and subscribe. Give us a 5-star review. That really helps Apple and Spotify and Podcast Addict, etc., to promote the podcast and put it kind of on the recommended. And lastly, you can support our podcast here by clicking the link to our anchor.fm, or you can follow us on our Patreon page. The anchor.fm, that's kind of, you can support us with a dollar. You can commit to give us $20 every month for here until eternity. But with the
Inflation's a real
Patreon,
pain. Remember that.
yeah. But with our Patreon page, we have one tier. It is $5, and that gives you access to exclusive content. Sometimes we do Patreon supporters only podcast series. Colin did one on the Supreme Court. We share a lot of our source data that we get during our prep, some interesting articles there on Patreon as well. You also, on our Patreon page, have exclusive access to Colin and myself, Jay. You can ask us any questions. You can tell us what you think. You can tell us that we're crazy. You can tell us anything you want.
We invite the debate.
We invite the debate. And we're not afraid of hate speech because, like I said in an earlier episode, hate speech isn't a thing. So we're very pro freedom of speech here, so you can say what you want. And lastly, we just want to say thank you for listening. We appreciate your time. It is not lost on us that no matter where you are in the world, you chose to listen to Colin and myself rant and rave about political parties, and for that we say thank you. So join us next week, and we look forward to seeing you then.